All right, hi everybody, John Meadows here, and today I have a great topic for you, and it's in the news a lot lately, and it's range of motion. What's a proper range of motion? Should you train with a full range of motion, partial range of motion? You know, what exactly should you do? Now, if you've watched my videos, you've seen me emphasize in many exercises using a full range of motion, and then in some exercises, I'm not really using a full range of motion. So I'm going to talk about why that is, but before I get into that, I've always been a fan of this topic. There's a limited amount of research out there. If you look at Brad Schoenfeld's book, which is a fantastic book, I love it. On this topic, he has 6 studies mentioned. 5 are untrained subjects. One is, I think there's a Pinto and colleagues. I always think of the Pinto, the Ford Pinto car. There's a McMahon and colleagues. McMahon, I don't think of Jim McMahon when he's with the Chicago Bears. And then, so there's 5 untrained groups, and then there was one group that was trained. It was GoTo or something like that. I always just say GoTo. It's the go-to documentation there for saying that partial range of motion can be more effective. But anyways, I also follow Chris Beardsley's work very closely. Chris Beardsley talks about a little bit more than that. I think maybe Chris mentions 7 or 8 different studies that were carried out with kind of mixed results. Brad's book tends to favor more of a range of motion in most cases, and Chris's is a little bit more mixed. And those are the 2 guys I look up to the most when I'm looking at kind of the scientific literature on the subject. And long story short, it's kind of mixed. So, and there's reasons for that. So if you look at some of the studies, they're basically done on legs or arms. You're looking at elbow flexors, elbow extensors, bis and tris, or you're looking at a leg extension, or you're looking at a squat. I mean, that's what most of these studies are looking at. And so, you know, rather than just take the thought of a study and what it proves or doesn't prove, you got to really look at the study. So, like if you think about the range of motion, for example, what's a partial range of motion? Well, if you're talking about squats, you have a full range of motion, and then you have a partial range of motion. But what is a partial range of motion? It could just be the top, where you're just doing little quarter squats that everybody likes to make fun of. Or you could be doing a partial out of the bottom and getting deep and only coming up 3/4 of the way. Or the partial could be not real high or not real deep, but kind of in the sweet spot in the middle. So first of all, what is the partial range of motion they're even looking at? Because the partial range of motion that they're using is going to make a huge difference. And one of the things you need to understand is when you're thinking about your range of motion is what are you trying to train? Let's say you want bigger inner thighs. Let's say you want a bigger adductor magnus, the big thick one in your inner thigh. I talked about this in my leg training manual a couple years ago. Well, you want to get into a deeper position on a squat. So if you're doing a partial range of motion where you're working out of the bottom and you're not going up all the way, is that less effective than a full range of motion where you come up all the way? Probably not. But if you're doing a partial range of motion from the top and you're only coming down halfway, then yeah, that's not going to be as effective for your adductor magnus, those inner thighs. So you really got to understand this at a much deeper level than just saying this study shows this. You got to look at how the study was done. Anyway, so what is a partial range of motion? What's a full range of motion? So that brings us to our first point. What exactly even is a full range of motion? Let's say you're doing a squat. Let's say you go down to a certain depth. Let's say you're squatting for your quads. Let's say you go down to a certain depth, okay? There is a point at which you go below that, you may start rounding your back. You may not even get as much tension in your quads. You may just start engaging your adductors a little bit more, maybe your glutes a little bit more. So if your goal is to train your quads, did that little bit extra at the bottom help you? I would argue and say no. Now, if your goal was to say, like I said in my earlier example, I want a bigger inner thigh adductor magnus, then yes, you want to go all the way down. So the first thing you got to understand, what is the right range of motion, and it's going to depend on what you're trying to train. Now that's a little more complex of an exercise. It's a multi-joint exercise as opposed to like a single, like a machine curl. That's much more simple. So the first thing you got to do is you got to understand what it is you're trying to train. You know, I see people doing rows or their back work, and they're coming back to a certain point for their lats, and then they're going even further where you can see their shoulders rotating. You can see all kinds of muscles getting involved that's not going to help their lats. So is that a full range of motion? I would say it is, but you went past where it was even effective. You're essentially wasting energy. So you got to figure out the range of motion that targets the muscle that you're trying to hit, first of all. That's number one. Now, number two, when you talk about muscle growth, what are kind of the basics? a muscle, and this is one of the things I talk about in my seminars that I do. Muscles can grow a couple different ways. You can actually get the cross-sectional area, the fiber diameter bigger, or you can actually get the muscle fiber longer, lengthwise. Now, I didn't say it changed the origin and insertion of the muscle, but what I did say was you can actually change the length of the muscle fiber. Now, if you want to read up on that's a whole nother subject. Look up sarcomeres added in series. Then if you want to look more at the cross-sectional diameter of the fiber, look up, they're added in parallel. Myofibrils are added in parallel. That's a whole nother topic. That's probably a little too sciencey for us today. But here's the main point from that. When you do a full range of motion, when you get the stretch part of the range of motion, guess what gets triggered? You get more of that muscle fibers added in series, so you kind of lengthen the muscle fiber. And then when you're doing more of really I would say the positive part of the movement, and maybe this kind of the sweet spot, maybe not all the way up, maybe not all the way down, you get more of that tension that causes the increase in the diameter of the muscle fiber. So if you're doing a curl, maybe you're not going down quite all the way, but you're still working most of the range of motion, you're going to get a lot of tension that creates the increase in muscle fiber diameter. And that's generally what people talk about when they talk about muscle size. You very rarely hear people talk about the length of the muscle fiber, which is interesting because I think that is actually a really good topic. But I never see anybody talking about it except for mainly Chris Beardsley. He talks about it a lot. So from that perspective, it makes sense that you would want to use a good full range of motion, right? If you want to add muscle fibers in series, if you want to lengthen the muscle fiber, then you want to get into that stretch. The other thing is the negative part of the exercise. So when you're curling something up, the concentric part, you get these, they're called active elements. There's actin and myosin cross bridges, blah, blah, blah. But when you're lowering it, there's also tension involved there. And there's a molecule called titin, actually, that that's another one if you want to look up. It's a whole other topic. But anyways, that can stimulate the lengthening into a stretch, can also stimulate adding that muscle fiber length. So to me, I think logically, I would want to have some stuff where I'm really stretched out, a really good full range of motion, but at the same time, also maybe want a little bit of the partial stuff to really focus on adding thickness to the diameter of the muscle. So that would seem to support maybe doing a little bit of both. Now, so your question might be, well, why not just do all of a full range of motion? So that brings me to my next point, the exercise itself. So I posted a video up last week of DeAndre Campbell doing some preacher curls. And he wasn't going all the way down. He was going about 4/5 of the way down. And there were a couple comments of people saying, why aren't you going all the way down? Because it's a massive injury risk. There are certain exercises that I just don't believe are made to go to an extreme full range of motion. I just don't believe it. I believe that if you do like a barbell preacher curl, if you go all the way down till your arm is completely extended, I think that's a bad idea. I think you can tear your bicep. So I think it's a bad idea. If you look at other exercises, let's say a stiff-legged deadlift, there's a certain point where you're going back and your hamstrings will eventually get fully stretched. And that's good. You go beyond that, and all of a sudden your lower back's coming into play. A lot of other things are coming into play. If you look at a squat, there's a certain point where you get down all the way, then your mechanics start to break down. You see people's back rounding, you see all kinds of bad stuff at the bottom. Now, I would argue that's not really a full range of motion. That's just range of motion you don't need. But anyways, there are some exercises I think you gotta be careful on. Think about how I do incline barbell presses. You'll never see me touching normally. I'm keeping an inch or two above my chest. That's because my shoulders feel a million times better when I do that. And guess what? My clients have the same experience. So a lot of it is dictated by the exercise. I just don't think certain exercises should be done with a massive full range of motion like a preacher curl. I think it's too much injury risk. Now, the way you exercise or the way you execute the exercise is also something to think about. If you do an incline bench and you bring your grip in and you do it more for triceps or upper chest, now you can come all the way down. There's not as much stress on your shoulder in terms of unhealthy stress. So if you see me doing a closer incline press, I will come all the way down because it feels normal and doesn't hurt my shoulders. And what happens is when you train for 20 or 30 years, you start to figure this stuff out. And you start to realize hey, that study might have said I should do a full range of motion, but that study doesn't understand how my shoulders feel. And if you really want longevity, you got to kind of learn exercises that you got to be careful with your range of motion. Now there's another facet involved. What about the structure of the person? Let's say you're talking about a guy who's really tall, tall spine, long femur, and he's squatting. Maybe for him to get down all the way, it involves a lot of forward leaning, and it becomes almost a spinal erector exercise for him, almost a good morning. If his goal is quads, is that good? Should I tell him to go lower? Should I tell him he's cheating? No. I would want to change his form, or probably better yet, change exercises so that his quads are more targeted. So you have to look at the exercise. You have to look at the structure of the person. You have to look at those two things as well. Now, what about the profile of the exercise? There's another variable. So when you talk about an exercise profile, it just means that some parts of the range of motion are harder than others, right? So if you look at a squat, it's harder out of the bottom than it is out of the top. Exercises that have a kind of a not so flat profile, where it's really hard at one spot, tend to produce more muscle growth too. So that would suggest you do need a full range of motion on exercises that are where the exercise profile is not exactly equal. Now you got to be careful, because if you look at something like a preacher curl, that's a great example of an exercise profile that's really hard. So yeah, you could use a lighter dumbbell, you could use a band, but to get more tension once you get out of the hardest spot. But I don't want you guys like banding every single exercise, trying to get the perfect exercise profile. That's not necessary. My only point is I'm just trying to throw out different factors so you guys can think. So you don't just say, yes, I need a really extreme range of motion on every exercise, or no, that's not necessary at all. Okay, so you just got to think. Think about the exercise, and the other thing you can think about, is it a compound movement or is it an isolation movement? If you look at some of the studies that I told you about in Brad's book, there's 6 of them, for example, a lot of them are just done with elbow flexion, right? And some of them are done with elbow extension. In fact, one of the go-to one, GOTO, or I call GOTO, that's a tricep study where they talk about a full range of motion versus a range of motion where you don't go all down all the way and you don't come up all the way, so you stay in that sweet spot. And guess what had more growth? The second one, the partial, where you work the middle part of the range of motion. So if you're really basing everything just on science, then right there's a study that says, hey, for that exercise, maybe you want to keep constant tension. Now, there were other ones, like quadricep exercises in those studies, where if you went through a full range of motion, you got more overall quad growth, and the reason why is because the end of that is a lot of teardrop. So if you're only using a partial out of the bottom, you're not getting as much teardrop, so that would make sense. So a lot of information, but again, I just want the point to be, you can't say that every single exercise has to have a full range of motion. You have to look at the exercise, you have to look at the person doing it, how's their form. And then I think some people mistake, and one of the guys is doing a great job of this is Coach Chasm Hansen is doing a great job of teaching people what a full range of motion actually is, because that's where all this really starts. It's what actually is the full range of motion. You know, I squat sometimes and people say, well, you're not going, butt to grass. You're not going all the way down. Well, no, I don't want to kill my back, and I'm trying to load my quads, so why would I do that? So there's a complete misunderstanding of what a full range of motion actually is for most people. So what do I do in practice? Well, I use some things where I do a crazy full range of motion and some where I don't. And you're going to have to find the exercises that kind of fit that best for you. If your goal is to just make an Instagram video where it looks cool because you do a quarter squat, that's not the kind of partial range of motion I'm saying is beneficial. But let's say you go down pretty low and you maybe come up 3/4 of the way. That's not a full range of motion, but that's extremely beneficial. The other interesting thing about the studies was that lower body exercises tend to favor the full range of motion. So if you've seen me do hack squats or pendulum squats, or Mike Israetel, who talks about range of motion a lot, if you look at him when he's doing hack squats, we all believe in doing really deep hack squats. You can safely load, your back's not at risk, you can get down really deep in your exercises, and Mike does a really nice job of that. And actually, if you look at his legs have grown a lot over the past year. And when I had to quit squatting heavy due to my lower back, I relied more on hack squats and things like that, and my legs actually got bigger too. So anyways, it's kind of interesting to note too that a lot of the lower body muscles seem to respond better to a full range of motion as well. So there's a lot of factors. Then the other thing you can do is use a full range of motion on some exercises and then go into partials to extend the set. If you see us do leg curls, we'll do a full range of motion, then we'll add in some more partials. Do those partials, are they meaningless? Heck no, they're not meaningless. They drive a ton of blood in there, they create a lot of tension, and tension and force is really what's going to create muscle growth, having that massive amount of tension in the muscle fiber. So I just want to just give you some different perspective on this whole range of motion conversation. Generally speaking, I think a full range of motion is the way to go, but there are going to be certain circumstances where you're probably not going to want to use a full range of motion. And again, there is some evidence to say that there is certain parts of the range of motion where you can load the muscle a little harder and you can get a little bit more of that cross-sectional muscle fiber diameter. You know, I would use something like a preacher curl as an example there. Don't go all the way down. That's a good example of something I would do a partial range of motion on. So anyways, I can't say you have to use it all the time or never use a full range of motion. Generally speaking, use a full range of motion most of the time, but don't be married to it. And then again, I think the other key point is understand what a full range of motion is for the muscle you're trying to train. Because I think a lot of people don't really understand what that range is for that target muscle. And if you want to look at what Coach Kaz is doing with N1, they do a great job of that. Anyway, so those are some thoughts. Comment below if you have any questions. I appreciate the support, and we'll see you next time.